What happens when three lives, each shaped by struggle and resilience, cross paths? In this story, we follow Rachel, a single mother overwhelmed by hardship, Judge Calhoun, a strict enforcer of the law who begins to question his role, and Amanda, a passionate advocate who faces the toll of helping others. Rachel's desperate plea in court triggers a series of unexpected events, changing the course of her life, the judge who sentenced her, and the woman who offered her a lifeline. But what happens next will surprise you. Will they overcome their personal battles, or will their pasts hold them back? Watch as second chances turn into life-changing opportunities. Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of redemption and hope. Rachel Parker stood outside the towering courthouse, her breath visible in the cold morning air. The courthouse loomed above her like a monolith, its gray stone exterior reflecting the heaviness in her chest. The town was small, but the courthouse had a reputation for harsh rulings. Today, it was her turn to face judgment, and the weight of it pressed down on her shoulders. Her 7-year-old son Daniel clung to her hand, his small fingers cold and trembling, though she wasn't sure if it was from the chill or the tension that radiated from her. She glanced at Daniel, his innocent eyes scanning the street, oblivious to the gravity of their situation. She couldn't help but feel guilty. She had worked so hard to shield him from the constant pressures of their life, balancing multiple jobs, barely making rent, and the endless bills that always seemed to arrive at the worst possible time. But this was something she couldn't protect him from. The $250 parking ticket had been a cruel blow. Not just because of the amount, which felt like a fortune, but because of the circumstances. Rachel had parked in a handicapped spot at the pharmacy that day, desperate to pick up Daniel's medication. He'd been coughing so badly in the back seat that she hadn't thought twice about it, just rushed inside, hoping the line would move quickly. But the line hadn't moved quickly, and by the time she returned to the car, the bright orange ticket was waiting for her like a slap in the face. Now she was here, at the mercy of Judge William Calhoun, the most feared judge in town. Her stomach turned at the thought. Calhoun had a reputation for being rigid, unforgiving, and immune to the personal stories that people brought into his courtroom. The law was the law, and he enforced it without exception. Rachel swallowed hard, knowing that no matter how well she explained herself, he might still demand the full fine. "Mommy, why are we here?" Daniel's small voice pulled her from her spiraling thoughts. Rachel forced a smile, crouching down so she could look at him in the eye. "We just have to talk to the judge about the ticket, sweetie. It'll be over soon." He nodded, though he didn't seem convinced. His eyes wandered back to the imposing courthouse, its towering pillars making the building seem more like a fortress than a place of justice. Rachel stood up, took a deep breath, and led him inside. The inside of the courthouse was as intimidating as the outside. The ceilings were high, and the heavy wooden doors groaned as they closed behind her. The sound echoed through the nearly empty hall, making Rachel feel as though they were entering a different world, one where people like her didn't belong. Her footsteps, soft but hurried, reverberated across the polished floors, making her feel exposed. She could feel the eyes of the security guards, the clerks, and the few others who waited outside the courtroom on her back. Her heart raced as they approached the courtroom doors. The gold plaque read, "Courtroom 2, a simple inscription, but to Rachel, it might as well have read the end of the road. She knew that if the judge upheld the fine, it would mean cutting back on groceries, or worse, missing a rent payment. It was the kind of situation she had worked so hard to avoid since Daniel's father left. But now there was no avoiding it. "Rachel Parker?" The bailiff's voice startled her. She turned to face the large man in uniform standing by the door holding a clipboard. "Yes, that's me," Rachel replied, her voice trembling. She squeezed Daniel's hand and he squeezed back, though she wasn't sure if it was for his comfort or hers. The bailiff gave a curt nod and gestured toward the door. "You're up." Rachel swallowed hard and led Daniel into the courtroom. The courtroom was almost empty. A few spectators sat on the wooden benches in the back, and a clerk busied herself with paperwork at the front. But the most intimidating figure in the room sat behind a large oak desk at the center, Judge William Calhoun. His black robe gave him an air of authority, but it was his stern face that made Rachel's heart race. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a sharp, angular face that made him look like he hadn't smiled in years. His hair was gray, cropped close to his head, and his piercing eyes seemed to take in everything with cold detachment. Rachel had heard stories about Judge Calhoun. He had a reputation for being strict, some even said cruel in his rulings. He didn't care about the excuses people gave him. He only cared about the law. And today, she was the one standing before him. Rachel's knees wobbled as she approached the desk. Daniel at her side. She glanced down at him, his wide eyes scanning the room with curiosity, blissfully unaware of the seriousness of their situation. "State your name for the record," the judge's voice boomed, startling Rachel. Rachel Parker, Your Honor," she stammered, trying to steady her voice. The judge didn't look up. He was flipping through a file on his desk, his expression unreadable. "You are here because you were cited for parking in a handicapped space without a permit. Is that correct?" Rachel nodded, though she realized too late that he wasn't looking at her. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Calhoun glanced up briefly, his eyes cold and calculating. "Do you understand the severity of this violation?" Rachel swallowed hard. She had prepared herself for this. She had spent days rehearsing what she would say, trying to find the right words to make the judge understand. But now, standing in front of him, all those words seemed to vanish. "Yes, Your Honor," she managed to say, though her voice was barely above a whisper. "But if I could explain..." The judge held up a hand, silencing her. "You may have your chance, Ms. Parker. For now, I need the facts." Rachel's heart sank. The facts. The facts were simple. She had parked in a handicapped space without a permit. She had broken the law, but what about everything else? What about Daniel's coughing, the long pharmacy line, the pressure of being a single mother juggling 2 jobs? Would any of that matter? As Rachel stood there, waiting for her chance to explain, her mind drifted back to the past few years. Life hadn't always been this hard. There was a time, back when she was still in college, when she had dreams of becoming a teacher, of making a difference in the lives of children. She had met Tom, Daniel's father, during her sophomore year. He was charming, funny, and full of promises about the future they would build together. But then everything changed. Rachel became pregnant with Daniel, and Tom, once so full of enthusiasm for their future, began to withdraw. The late nights, the excuses, the growing distance. It had all been a sign of things to come. By the time Daniel was born, Tom was barely around, and not long after he left for good. No explanation, no apologies, just gone. Rachel had been devastated. She had dropped out of college, taking on whatever job she could find to make ends meet. Waitressing, cleaning houses, working late shifts at the bakery. It didn't matter what the work was, as long as it paid enough to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. And now, standing in front of Judge Calhoun, all of that seemed to be hanging over her like a weight she couldn't lift. She was exhausted, she was scared, and she didn't know how much longer she could keep going like this. "Mommy, I'm hungry." The small voice cut through the tense silence of the courtroom like a knife. Rachel's heart dropped into her stomach as she looked down at Daniel. His wide, innocent eyes blinked at her, completely unaware of the storm he had just unleashed. The courtroom fell silent. Rachel's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. This wasn't the time for Daniel to be talking about food. Not here. Not now. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," Rachel stammered, her voice shaking as she tried to regain control of the situation. "We didn't have time for breakfast this morning and..." Judge Calhoun raised a hand, silencing her again. His sharp eyes shifted from Rachel to Daniel, who was still tugging on his mother's sleeve, unaware of the tension in the room. "What did you say, young man?" the judge asked, his tone surprisingly soft compared to his earlier, harsher demeanor. Daniel looked up at the judge, his small voice unwavering. "I said I'm hungry. Can we get burgers after this?" Rachel's heart stopped. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Daniel, her sweet, innocent son, was talking to the most feared judge in town about burgers in the middle of a court hearing. The courtroom murmured in disbelief. People in the back row exchanged glances, unsure of how the judge would react. But instead of the anger Rachel had expected, something remarkable happened. Judge Calhoun's stern expression softened. His eyebrows lifted, and for a brief moment, Rachel could have sworn she saw the hint of a smile. "You like burgers, do you?" the judge asked. His voice was still gentle. Daniel nodded enthusiastically, oblivious to the tension around him. "With extra cheese." Rachel's face turned crimson with embarrassment. This was it. The judge was going to throw the book at her now. Not only would he make her pay the full fine, but he might even increase it for wasting the court's time. But then, Judge Calhoun did something completely unexpected. The judge leaned back in his chair, folding his arms over his chest as he considered Daniel's response. The room was still, the air thick with anticipation. Rachel could feel her heart pounding in her chest, waiting for the judge's next move. After a long pause, Judge Calhoun spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Ms. Parker," he said, his eyes returning to Rachel, "I understand that you are here because you violated the law. Parking in a handicapped space without a permit is a serious offense." Rachel's stomach twisted. Here it comes, she thought, the punishment. "But," the judge continued, "it seems that there are extenuating circumstances here." Rachel blinked, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "I'd like to hear more about your situation, Ms. Parker," Judge Calhoun said. "Tell me about your son. Tell me why you felt you needed to park in that space." Rachel's heart raced. This was her chance. She hadn't expected the judge to give her the opportunity to explain, but now he was asking for her story. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. And so, with Daniel still tugging on her sleeve, Rachel began to tell her story. Rachel took a deep breath before she began, her eyes shifting between Judge Calhoun and the curious onlookers in the courtroom. Every muscle in her body tensed, knowing this was her one chance to explain herself. Daniel stood quietly beside her, holding her hand, unaware of the gravity of the situation. "Your Honor, I know I made a mistake, and I accept that," Rachel started, her voice trembling, "but I just want you to understand why it happened." Judge Calhoun nodded slightly, signaling for her to continue. His expression was neutral, giving away no indication of his thoughts. "I'm a single mother," Rachel began, her voice gaining some strength. "Daniel, my son, had been sick for days. I had to go to the pharmacy to get his medication. That day, the parking lot was full, and Daniel was coughing so badly in the back seat. I didn't know what else to do. I just needed to get in and out quickly." Rachel paused, trying to gauge the judge's reaction, but his face remained stoic. She pressed on. "I parked in the handicapped spot thinking I would only be a minute, but the line inside was so long. By the time I got back to the car, the ticket was there." She sighed, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. "I'm not trying to excuse what I did, but it wasn't out of disregard for the law. I was just desperate to help my son." There was a brief silence in the courtroom. Rachel could feel the weight of the eyes on her, judging her just as much as the man behind the bench. She took another breath, her fingers tightening around Daniel's small hand. "I work 2 jobs, Your Honor," Rachel added, her voice quieter now, almost apologetic. "I'm a waitress at a diner, and I also work night shifts at a bakery. It's hard, but I do what I can to provide for Daniel. This fine, though, it's more than I can handle right now. I can't afford it." As the words left her mouth, Rachel felt the familiar sting of shame rise in her chest. She hated having to admit that. She hated standing there, exposed in front of a courtroom full of strangers confessing her financial struggles. Judge Calhoun leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. He said nothing for a long moment, letting Rachel's words hang in the air. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, with everyone waiting for his response. Judge Calhoun remained silent as he continued to study Rachel. His piercing eyes flickered to Daniel, who was now sitting on a bench near the front, swinging his legs and quietly playing with his hands. The innocence in the boy's face contrasted sharply with the weight of the situation. Rachel felt the room shrink around her, the uncertainty suffocating her as the judge began to speak. "Ms. Parker," he said finally, "I understand that you are facing difficult circumstances. You are not the first person to stand in this courtroom and plead hardship. But I'm here to enforce the law. And the law states that parking in a handicapped space without a permit is an offense that carries a fine." Rachel's heart sank. She could feel the crushing reality pressing down on her shoulders again. She had prayed for leniency, but it seemed as though Judge Calhoun was going to stick to the strict interpretation of the law. "But," the judge continued, causing Rachel's heart to flutter with a glimmer of hope, "I am not an unreasonable man. I believe that justice is not just about enforcing the law blindly. It is also about understanding the context of the offense." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Was he really about to show her compassion? She had heard so many stories about how rigid and unforgiving Judge Calhoun was. Could it be that those stories were wrong? "I will take your situation into account," Judge Calhoun said. "But that does not mean I can simply dismiss the fine. However, I am prepared to reduce it." A wave of relief washed over Rachel. It wasn't a complete dismissal, but a reduction was more than she had dared to hope for. "Your fine will be reduced to $100, the judge stated, his tone firm but fair. "I trust that you will be able to pay this amount within a reasonable time frame." Rachel nodded quickly, her heart racing with gratitude. "Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. Thank you so much." Judge Calhoun paused, then shifted his gaze to Daniel again, who was now watching the judge with wide, curious eyes. Something seemed to soften in the judge's expression. He looked back at Rachel. "You mentioned that you're working 2 jobs and caring for your son," he said. "That is a heavy burden to carry on your own." Rachel nodded, unsure of where the conversation was heading. "I believe that you could benefit from some additional support," Judge Calhoun continued. "There are resources available in our community. Programs designed to help single mothers like yourself, childcare assistance, job training, even educational opportunities." Rachel blinked, stunned. This was not what she had expected to hear from the man who was supposed to be the most feared judge in town. "There is a program at the local community college," the judge added. "They offer online degrees that might help you improve your situation. I'm going to give you a list of resources. Use them. You don't have to do this alone." For a moment, Rachel couldn't speak. She felt a lump in her throat as she realized what was happening. Judge Calhoun, the same man she had feared so deeply, was offering her a way out, a way to not just survive, but to thrive. Thank you, Your Honor," Rachel stammered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say." The judge gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. "No thanks necessary, Ms. Parker. Just take care of your son and take advantage of the opportunities that are available to you." As Rachel gathered her things and prepared to leave the courtroom, she felt a sense of relief and disbelief wash over her. The reduced fine was still a blow to her finances, but it was manageable. And the list of resources the judge had given her, it felt like a lifeline. For so long she had been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, thinking that she had to do it all on her own. But now, for the first time in years, it felt like just maybe, there was a way forward. "Mommy, can we get burgers now?" Daniel's voice broke through her thoughts, his innocent question reminding her of the surreal moment in the courtroom. Rachel laughed softly, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. "Yes, sweetie, I think we can get burgers." As they left the courthouse, stepping out into the crisp afternoon air, Rachel couldn't help but smile. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like the future was something worth looking forward to. As Rachel and Daniel walked toward the diner down the street where they would finally get the burgers Daniel had been asking for, Rachel's mind drifted back to the last few years. So much had changed since Tom had left. So much had been lost. Tom had been her first love, the man she thought she would spend her life with. They had met when Rachel was just 19, young and full of dreams. Back then, life had seemed full of possibilities. She was in college, working toward her teaching degree, and Tom was studying business. They had talked endlessly about their future together, about the house they would buy, the family they would raise, the life they would build. But when Rachel became pregnant with Daniel, everything changed. Tom's enthusiasm for their future slowly faded, replaced by frustration and resentment. He had grown distant, spending more and more time away from home. By the time Daniel was born, their relationship had crumbled, and not long after that, Tom left for good. Rachel had been devastated, but she didn't have time to grieve. She had a newborn to care for, bills to pay, and no partner to rely on. She dropped out of college and took on 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. For years it had been a struggle, barely scraping by, never having enough, always worrying about what might go wrong next. But now, as she held Daniel's hand and walked toward the diner, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. As they sat in the booth at the diner, Daniel eagerly munching on his cheeseburger, Rachel stared at the piece of paper Judge Calhoun had given her. It listed several local programs, child care assistance, job training, and even educational opportunities. She read the words over and over, hardly believing that these resources were within her reach. Could she really go back to school? Could she really pursue her dream of earning a degree and giving Daniel the life he deserved? The doubt crept in quickly, but Rachel pushed it aside. She had been through so much already. Surely she could handle one more challenge. As she watched Daniel laugh and enjoy his meal, Rachel felt a surge of determination. She wasn't going to let fear stop her. She was going to do whatever it took to build a better future for her son. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem so impossible. Days after the court hearing, Rachel found herself sitting at the kitchen table late at night, staring blankly at the list of resources Judge Calhoun had given her. The kitchen was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the overhead light. Daniel was already in bed, his quiet snores drifting from the next room. Normally, this would be Rachel's time to unwind from the day, but instead, she felt a familiar unease creeping back into her mind. The court case had given her temporary relief, a reduced fine and a lifeline in the form of community resources. But now that the dust had settled, she couldn't shake the doubt gnawing at her. The piece of paper with its list of child care programs, job training, and educational opportunities felt more like a fantasy than a reality she could grasp. Could she really go back to school? She had dropped out when Daniel was born, and that felt like a lifetime ago. Since then, she had been in survival mode, working long hours just to keep the roof over their heads and food on the table. The idea of balancing coursework, work shifts, and taking care of Daniel felt impossible. Rachel leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes, willing herself to push the doubt aside. But it kept resurfacing, louder and more insistent each time. Maybe she wasn't cut out for school anymore. Maybe it was too late. She sighed and put her head in her hands, the weight of everything pressing down on her like an invisible force. The next day, Rachel woke up to the sound of Daniel coughing. She rushed to his side, instinctively placing her hand on his forehead. He didn't have a fever, but the cough was the same deep, chesty sound that had worried her weeks before. Her heart sank at the thought of him getting sick again. "Mommy, I don't feel good," Daniel said, his voice raspy and weak. Rachel's chest tightened. She had planned on heading to work early that morning, but Daniel needed her. She couldn't leave him like this. "I know, sweetheart," Rachel said softly, brushing his hair away from his forehead. "I'll stay with you today." As she made breakfast, her mind raced. Missing work meant missing a day's pay, and with the bakery already reducing her hours, every shift counted. The reduced fine from the court helped, but it hadn't changed the fact that money was still tight. Every missed paycheck was a step closer to falling behind on bills again. She glanced over at the list of resources still sitting on the kitchen counter. The idea of going back to school seemed even more distant now. How could she possibly add another responsibility to her plate when she was already stretched so thin? As the weeks passed, Rachel found herself teetering on the edge of exhaustion. Between her shifts at the diner and the bakery, taking care of Daniel, and the constant anxiety about money, she felt like she was barely keeping her head above water. Every day seemed like a battle to get through, and the hope she had felt after the court hearing was quickly fading. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, Rachel sat at the kitchen table, staring at her laptop. She had pulled up the website for the local community college that Judge Calhoun had mentioned, the one offering online degrees. She scrolled through the course catalog, her eyes skimming over the programs that could open doors to better opportunities. Marketing, education, business administration. It all sounded so promising, so out of reach. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to fill out the application. But her mind was flooded with doubts. What if she failed? What if she couldn't keep up with the coursework? What if going back to school was just another mistake? Rachel closed the laptop with a sigh, the weight of her doubts crushing her resolve. She couldn't afford to fail, not when Daniel was counting on her. It was a rainy Friday afternoon when everything seemed to come crashing down. Rachel had just finished her shift at the bakery, exhausted and drenched from the downpour outside, when she received a call from Daniel's school. "He's running a fever," the nurse said on the other end of the line. "You'll need to come pick him up." Rachel's heart dropped. She couldn't afford to leave work early, but she also couldn't leave Daniel at school when he was sick. She gathered her things quickly, telling her boss that she had to go, though she could already feel the frustration in his voice. She rushed to the school, the rain pouring down harder as she ran through the parking lot to the front office. When she saw Daniel sitting in the nurse's office, pale and shivering, her heart broke. She scooped him up in her arms, his small body limp and tired. The nurse handed Rachel a note with instructions to follow up with their doctor if his fever didn't break within the next 24 hours. Rachel thanked her, though her mind was already racing. Doctor's visits meant more bills, more time off work, more stress. As she carried Daniel back to the car, the rain soaking through her jacket, Rachel felt the weight of everything come crashing down. She was doing everything she could to hold it together, but it was never enough. No matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she sacrificed, there was always something waiting to knock her down again. That night, as Daniel lay in bed with a thermometer tucked under his arm, Rachel sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling. She had called out of work for the next day to stay home with Daniel, and the thought of missing another shift sent a wave of panic through her. The medical bills from Daniel's last illness were still hanging over her, and now there would be more. She buried her face in her hands, feeling the tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She had fought so hard for so long, and it still wasn't enough. She was so tired of fighting, so tired of carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. For the first time in months, Rachel let herself cry. She cried for the dreams she had let go of, for the life she had wanted but never had, for the endless struggle of being a single mother. She cried for Daniel, who deserved so much more than she could give him. The list of resources Judge Calhoun had given her sat on the counter untouched. Rachel glanced at it through tear-filled eyes, her heart aching with a mixture of hope and hopelessness. Could she really start over? Could she really make a better life for herself and Daniel? At that moment, it felt impossible. The next morning, Rachel woke up to the sound of her phone ringing. She groggily answered, surprised to see a number she didn't recognize. "Hello?" she answered. Her voice was rough from the night before. "Ms. Parker? This is Amanda Collins from the Single Parents Resource Center," a friendly voice said on the other end of the line. "Judge Calhoun mentioned that you might benefit from some of our services, and I wanted to reach out to see how we can help." Rachel blinked, trying to process the words. She hadn't expected anyone to actually follow up with her after the court hearing. The thought of reaching out for help had felt overwhelming, but now it seemed that help was reaching out to her. "I don't know," Rachel stammered, still in disbelief. "I'm not sure what kind of help I need." Amanda's voice was warm and understanding. "That's okay. We can start by talking about your situation. We offer child care assistance, job training, educational programs, whatever you need to help lighten the load. I understand you've been working 2 jobs while raising your son on your own. We're here to support you." Rachel's heart fluttered with a mix of relief and hesitation. The idea of receiving help, of not having to do everything on her own, felt foreign, but it also felt like a lifeline, one that she so desperately needed. "I'd like that," Rachel said. her voice trembling with emotion. "I really would." The phone call with Amanda Collins had lit a small spark of hope in Rachel. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't facing the overwhelming weight of life alone. The resources offered by the Single Parents Resource Center seemed like a way forward, but Rachel was still cautious. She'd learned long ago that promises of help didn't always come through. A week after the phone call, Rachel found herself sitting in Amanda's small office at the resource center, Daniel happily drawing at a table in the corner. Amanda was warm and approachable, with a kind smile and a calm voice that put Rachel at ease. "So, how are you feeling about everything?" Amanda asked, looking at Rachel with genuine interest. Rachel hesitated for a moment, glancing at Daniel before answering. "I don't know. It's hard to imagine things changing. I've been doing this for so long, working 2 jobs, raising Daniel, just trying to keep up. It's exhausting." Amanda nodded sympathetically. "I understand. You've been carrying a heavy load, but you don't have to do it alone. That's why we're here, to help you find some balance." Rachel took a deep breath. She had never been one to ask for help. But Amanda made it seem like asking for support wasn't a weakness. Maybe it was time to let someone else carry some weight. Over the next few weeks, Rachel began to take advantage of the programs Amanda had told her about. She was hesitant at first, unsure if any of it would really make a difference. But slowly, as she attended workshops and connected with other single mothers going through similar struggles, Rachel started to feel like there was a way out of the endless cycle of stress and exhaustion. One of the most impactful changes came when Amanda helped her secure part-time childcare for Daniel. It was a game changer. For the first time in years, Rachel could focus on herself for a few hours each day, knowing that Daniel was safe and well cared for. With Daniel in good hands, Rachel had more time to focus on another opportunity Amanda had pointed her toward: the local community college's online degree program. It was the same program Judge Calhoun had mentioned in court, and though Rachel had been hesitant about returning to school, she couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, this was her chance to turn things around. One evening, after Daniel had gone to bed, Rachel sat at her kitchen table staring at her laptop screen. The application for the online degree program opened in front of her, and her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Her heart pounded with a mix of excitement and fear. Could she really do this? Could she go back to school while still juggling work and being a mother? The doubts were still there, whispering that she wasn't cut out for this, but Amanda's words from earlier echoed in her mind. "You don't have to do this alone." With a deep breath, Rachel filled out the application and clicked Submit. The weeks that followed were both exhilarating and exhausting. Rachel had been accepted into the community college's marketing program, a field that had always intrigued her but had seemed unattainable for so long. Now, with the support of the Single Parents Resource Center and part-time childcare for Daniel, Rachel felt like she was finally taking steps toward a better future. But it wasn't easy. Balancing her coursework with her shifts at the diner and the bakery left Rachel exhausted most days. There were times when she stayed up late into the night, hunched over her laptop, trying to finish assignments after long days of work. Daniel, now growing more aware of his mother's efforts, would often bring her a cup of water or a snack, offering his quiet support. Despite the exhaustion, there was something different about the way Rachel moved through her days. The crushing weight of hopelessness had lifted, replaced by a sense of purpose. She was working toward something bigger than just getting through each day. She was working for a better future for herself and for Daniel, but that didn't mean there weren't moments of doubt. There were nights when Rachel questioned whether she could keep up with the demands of school, work, and motherhood. When Daniel had a cold and she missed a shift at work to stay home with him, the familiar panic of falling behind crept in again. Still, she pressed on, knowing that this struggle wasn't for nothing. Just as Rachel was beginning to feel like she could manage the demands of her new life, an unexpected setback threatened to throw everything off course. It started with a simple text message from her boss at the bakery. "Need you to come in tomorrow morning. Short on staff." Rachel stared at the message, her stomach twisting in knots. She had a final exam scheduled for the same morning, a critical exam that could determine whether or not she passed one of her marketing courses. Missing the exam wasn't an option, but neither was missing a shift at work. With the bakery already reducing her hours due to her school schedule, Rachel couldn't afford to lose the job. She paced the small kitchen trying to figure out a solution. Could she talk to her professor about rescheduling the exam? Could she negotiate with her boss to let her take the morning off? The stress of the situation felt like a weight pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. After a sleepless night of tossing and turning, Rachel made a decision. She couldn't miss the exam. If she wanted to move forward with her education and create a better future, she had to prioritize school. With a heavy heart, she sent a polite message to her boss, explaining that she couldn't take the shift because of her final exam. She knew it was a risk, but it was a risk she had to take. The morning of the exam, Rachel arrived at the testing center with a mix of nerves and determination. She had studied hard, and she knew the material, but the stress of the situation weighed on her mind. As she took her seat in the quiet room, she forced herself to push the worries aside and focus on the test in front of her. The exam went smoothly, and as Rachel walked out of the testing center, she felt a surge of pride. She had done it. She had prioritized her education, and it felt like a small victory in the larger battle she was fighting. But her sense of accomplishment was short-lived. When she checked her phone after the exam, there was a message waiting for her from her boss. "We need someone more reliable. You're no longer needed at the bakery." Rachel's heart sank. She had lost one of her jobs, and with it, a significant portion of her income. The familiar panic crept back in. How would she make up for the lost hours? How would she pay the bills without the bakery shifts? For a moment, all the progress she had made felt like it was slipping through her fingers. She had fought so hard to build a better future, and now, with one job gone, it felt like everything was unraveling. As Rachel sat in her car, staring at the message on her phone, tears welled up in her eyes. It felt like the universe was playing a cruel joke on her. Every time she took a step forward, something pulled her back. But this time, Rachel didn't let the fear paralyze her. She wasn't the same person she had been months ago when everything felt hopeless. She had learned that she didn't have to face these challenges alone. With trembling hands, Rachel dialed Amanda's number. The phone rang twice before Amanda's warm voice answered. "Rachel, how are you?" Rachel swallowed the lump in her throat, trying to keep her voice steady. "I lost my job at the bakery. I don't know how I'm going to make ends meet without it." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Amanda spoke, her voice filled with calm reassurance. "I'm so sorry to hear that, Rachel. But don't worry. We'll figure this out. You're not in this alone. Let's talk about some options." Amanda's words were a balm to Rachel's frayed nerves. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she didn't have to carry the weight of the world on her own. True to her word, Amanda helped Rachel explore new job opportunities that would align with her school schedule. Within a week, Rachel had connected with a local nonprofit organization that needed part-time help with their marketing and communications, work that not only fit Rachel's schedule but also gave her the chance to apply the skills she was learning in her degree program. It was a perfect fit, and Rachel was hired almost immediately. The job paid better than the bakery and offered more flexibility, allowing Rachel to focus on both her coursework and caring for Daniel. For the first time in years, Rachel felt like she was moving forward, not just treading water. Rachel's life began to stabilize in ways she hadn't thought possible. With her new job and the progress she was making in her marketing program, she felt a renewed sense of purpose and confidence. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was building a future. One evening, after tucking Daniel into bed, Rachel sat down at the kitchen table and opened her laptop. As she looked over her coursework and the emails from her new job, she couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. She had come so far, from the scared, overwhelmed woman standing in front of Judge Calhoun, to a mother, student, and employee who was taking control of her life. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks, moments of doubt, and times when Rachel thought she might never climb out of the hole she had been in, but she kept going. And now, for the first time, it felt like the pieces of her life were finally falling into place. Rachel closed her laptop and looked out the window, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. The future wasn't as uncertain as it once had been. She had found her way through the darkness, and now she was standing in the light. Months passed, and Rachel's life began to settle into a new rhythm. She balanced her work at the nonprofit with her studies, and her coursework became more than just something she had to do. It became something she enjoyed. The marketing skills she was learning were not only useful at her job, but they gave her a sense of accomplishment she hadn't felt in years. The nonprofit's mission to support underserved communities resonated deeply with Rachel, and she felt proud to be part of something that made a difference. Her co-workers appreciated her dedication, and for the first time, Rachel felt like she was in a place where she belonged. Daniel, too, was thriving. The consistent childcare support gave him stability, and he had made new friends at the center. His health had improved, and his bright, curious nature was shining through more each day. Watching him laugh and play, Rachel often marveled at how far they had come since that day in the courthouse. One evening, after finishing up a report for work, Rachel leaned back in her chair and let her eyes wander around the small but cozy living room. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a deep sense of peace. The day Rachel had been working toward finally arrived, her graduation from the online marketing program. It wasn't a traditional graduation with a cap and gown, but it was every bit as meaningful. Rachel sat at her kitchen table, staring at the email that had confirmed she had completed her degree requirements with honors. Tears welled in her eyes as she read the words over and over, hardly believing it was real. She had done it. She had finished her degree, something she had once thought was impossible. Daniel ran into the room, curious about why his mom was crying. "Mommy, are you okay?" Rachel smiled through her tears, pulling him into her arms. "I'm okay, sweetheart. I'm more than okay. I did it. I graduated." Daniel's face lit up with excitement. "You did? That's awesome. Can we have a party?" Rachel laughed, hugging him tightly. "Yes, we can have a party. This is a big deal." That evening, they celebrated with pizza and ice cream, Daniel's favorite. As they sat on the floor of their living room, laughing and talking about the future, Rachel couldn't help but feel proud. She had come so far, and it was all for him. Everything she had done, every struggle she had faced, had been to give Daniel a better life. And now, she was finally in a place where that life felt possible. With her degree in hand, Rachel's professional life began to flourish. The nonprofit she had been working for offered her a full-time position, one that came with a pay raise and more responsibility. Her new title, marketing coordinator, was one she wore with pride, knowing that she had earned it through hard work and perseverance. The increased income allowed Rachel to move out of her cramped apartment and into a small but comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't anything extravagant, but it was theirs. And that was all that mattered. The house had a small backyard where Daniel could play, and Rachel often found herself standing at the window, watching him run around with his friends, her heart swelling with gratitude. For the first time in years, she felt like she had a solid foundation. She wasn't just scraping by anymore. She was building a future. The fear of falling behind, of not having enough, had faded. Instead, Rachel felt empowered, in control of her life in a way she hadn't been for years. Several months later, Rachel found herself back at the same courthouse where her journey had begun. But this time, she wasn't there as a defendant facing a fine. She had been invited to speak at a community event hosted by the Single Parents Resource Center. The topic? How community support could help single parents rebuild their lives. Rachel stood in front of a small but attentive audience, her heart pounding as she prepared to speak. She wasn't used to public speaking, but she knew this story needed to be shared. "Good afternoon," Rachel began, her voice steady but soft. "I'm Rachel Parker, and just a little over a year ago I was standing in this very courthouse, terrified of what my future held. I was a single mother, juggling 2 jobs, barely making ends meet. and I had just received a parking ticket that felt like the final straw in an already overwhelming life. She paused, glancing around the room, noticing the nods of understanding from some of the other parents in the audience. That day, something unexpected happened, Rachel continued. Judge Calhoun didn't just reduce my fine. He offered me something more. He gave me a list of resources that I had never known existed. Programs to help single parents, support services, and educational opportunities. It was a lifeline, one that changed my life. Rachel's voice grew stronger as she spoke about how she had gone back to school, how she had found a job that she loved, and how she had rebuilt her life with the help of the community. As she spoke, she noticed a familiar figure in the back of the room, Judge William Calhoun. He sat quietly, listening to her story with the same composed expression he had worn that day in the courtroom. But there was something different in his eyes, a flicker of pride. As a single mother, I spent years thinking I had to do everything on my own, Rachel said, her voice steady and confident. But what I've learned is that none of us have to do this alone. There is support out there, and it's okay to ask for help. In fact, it's necessary. The audience applauded as Rachel finished her speech, and she stepped down from the podium, her heart swelling with gratitude. As the crowd dispersed, Judge Calhoun approached her, his expression softer than she remembered. "You've come a long way, Ms. Parker," he said, extending his hand. Rachel smiled as she shook his hand. "I wouldn't have made it without that list you gave me. Thank you for seeing me as more than just another case file." The judge gave a small, rare smile. "You did the hard work. I just gave you a little push in the right direction." Rachel nodded, feeling a sense of closure. She had come full circle, and it felt good to stand in the courthouse again, not as someone who needed help, but as someone who had taken control of her life. As the weeks turned into months, Rachel's life continued to flourish. Her work at the nonprofit expanded, and she was eventually promoted to a leadership role, overseeing the organization's marketing efforts. Her story had become an inspiration to other single parents, and she often found herself mentoring others who were just beginning their journeys toward rebuilding their lives. Daniel, now thriving in school and growing more independent each day, was her constant source of joy. The house they shared became a home filled with laughter, warmth, and love. Rachel had never imagined that they would come this far, but they had, and she was proud, not only of what she had accomplished, but of the person she had become in the process. One evening, as Rachel and Daniel sat on the porch of their house watching the sunset, Daniel turned to her and said, "Mom, you're the strongest person I know." Rachel smiled, her heart full. "Thanks, buddy. But you know what? We're both pretty strong. We did this together." Daniel grinned, leaning against her shoulder. "Yeah, we did." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Rachel felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The road ahead was still unknown, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what the future held. She had faced her darkest moments, and she had come out stronger on the other side. Rachel Parker had built a life filled with purpose, joy, and hope. And she knew that whatever challenges came next, she was ready. The sharp crack of the gavel echoed in the courtroom as Judge William Calhoun concluded another case. His stern expression never wavered, the room silent under his command. But as he sat back in his chair, waiting for the next case, his mind wandered to a time when the law wasn't his anchor, when life had been about survival rather than justice. William had grown up in a neighborhood where opportunity was rare and hardship was common. His father, a mechanic who spent more hours at work than at home, taught him that life was hard, but hard work was the only way out. His mother juggled 3 part-time jobs, her hands always busy, her eyes always tired. The memory of his father's voice played in his mind often. "We don't break the rules, son. We survive by them." As a young man, William wasn't sure what to make of that advice. The world around him seemed full of people bending or breaking rules to get ahead. But his father's insistence on following the straight path resonated with him. The older William got, the more he understood that the rules were his only form of control in a chaotic world. After high school, William worked 2 jobs to put himself through law school. He saw the law as the great equalizer, a tool that could bring order to disorder, fairness to unfair situations. But as he climbed through the ranks and became a judge, the humanity of those standing before him began to blur. It wasn't the person he judged, it was the crime. This rigid mindset worked for most of his career. But all that changed when his wife, Claire, fell ill. Flashback. Claire had been diagnosed with cancer, and over the course of 2 years, William watched helplessly as the love of his life battled a disease he couldn't control. Claire had balanced his voice of reason when the world seemed too harsh. Without her, his life fell into a rhythm of work, loss, and cold detachment. By the time she passed, William had lost not only his wife, but also the part of him that believed in second chances. He threw himself deeper into his work, his judgments becoming stricter. If he couldn't save Claire, at least he could uphold the law with uncompromising resolve. The day Rachel Parker walked into his courtroom was like any other, or so William thought. She was just another single mother with excuses, just another person asking for mercy when they had clearly broken the law. But then there was Daniel, tugging on his mother's sleeve, asking for hamburgers in the middle of the trial. William had seen many outbursts in court, but none like this. It was a moment of innocence that disarmed him in a way he didn't expect. Something about Rachel and her son stayed with him after that day. The way she had stood there, vulnerable yet strong, reminding him of Claire during her final days. He had seen that same resolve in her eyes, the determination to keep going, no matter how hard things got. Over the next few weeks, William found himself thinking about Rachel more often than he expected. He had dismissed her fine and given her resources, but he wondered, what would happen to her? Would she make it out of her struggles, or would she be back in his courtroom in 6 months, deeper in debt? Internal conflict. For the first time in years, William began to question his approach. Had he been too harsh over the years? How many people had he condemned with his cold, rigid judgments? Claire had always believed in second chances, but after her death, William stopped seeing the value in them. Perhaps it was time for that to change. Amanda Collins sat at her desk, flipping through the case files of single mothers and fathers who had reached out to the resource center. Each name, each story, felt like a mirror of her own past. She could still remember the nights spent crying in her car after work, wondering how she was going to feed her kids the next day. Amanda had never planned on being a single mother. When her husband John died in a car accident, her world had crumbled. He had been her partner, her rock, and without him, she felt lost. She had been working as a preschool teacher at the time, but John's death left her not only heartbroken, but also struggling to support their 2 young children on a single income. Those were dark years spent juggling work, childcare, and a mountain of bills that seemed to grow no matter how hard she worked. Amanda had leaned on the support of friends, family, and community programs to get through it, and through that experience, she realized the power of community and the importance of offering help to those in need. That's why she had started working at the Single Parents Resource Center. She wanted to give others the lifeline she had been given when she was drowning. Internal reflection. As Amanda reviewed Rachel's file, she felt a deep sense of empathy. Rachel's story was different from hers in some ways, but the struggle was the same. The desperation, the fear, the weight of responsibility was all too familiar. Amanda had worked with hundreds of single parents over the years, but something about Rachel's case struck a chord with her. Maybe it was the way Rachel had stood in front of Judge Calhoun, quietly explaining her situation while holding her son's hand, or the way Rachel's voice had trembled when she said she was doing her best. Amanda saw herself in Rachel, saw the same exhaustion, the same quiet strength. Amanda prided herself on helping others, but lately, she had begun to feel the strain of the work. The more parents she helped, the more cases flooded in, and the more impossible it felt to reach everyone who needed her. Burnout was a constant threat, and there were nights when she lay awake, wondering if she was really making a difference. One afternoon, as she sat with Rachel, Amanda felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. Rachel had made progress, enrolling in school, finding childcare. But Amanda knew how fragile that progress was. She knew how quickly things could fall apart. It made her wonder, how many more people like Rachel were out there? How many more were slipping through the cracks? Amanda had been running the resource center for over a decade, but the constant pressure to do more, to be more, was beginning to take its toll. Flashback. She thought back to the days after John's death, those lonely nights when she had felt so completely overwhelmed by the weight of her grief and responsibilities. She had been close to giving up so many times, but it was the support of others that had kept her going. That was why she fought so hard now, why she pushed herself to help as many people as possible. But the cost was high. Amanda rarely took time for herself. Her own children, now in their teens, had started to notice how tired she was all the time. They had grown up seeing their mother dedicate herself to helping others. But lately, Amanda wondered if she was neglecting her own needs in the process. Judge Calhoun stood at the back of the community center, watching as Rachel took the stage. It had been months since her case, and he had kept an eye on her progress through Amanda's reports. Now seeing her up there, speaking about her journey and the help she had received, William felt a stirring in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. Rachel's words hit him hard. She spoke of second chances, of finding strength in community, and of how one moment of kindness had changed her life. It was a stark contrast to the way he had always viewed the law, as something cold and unyielding. As the applause died down, William walked up to Amanda, who had been standing nearby, listening with pride to Rachel's speech. "Amanda," he began, his voice gruff but sincere, "I think I've been wrong." Amanda looked at him, surprised. "Wrong about how I've approached my work," William admitted. "I've spent my career focusing on punishment, on enforcing the law without seeing the people behind it. But Rachel, she's shown me that there's more to justice than just following the rules." Amanda smiled softly, sensing the shift in him. "It's never too late to see things differently, Judge Calhoun." William nodded, deep in thought. "Maybe it's time I started seeing people again." Judge William Calhoun sat at his desk late one evening, long after the courthouse had emptied. The room was dimly lit, the only sound the occasional shuffle of papers as he worked through the remaining case files on his desk. But his mind wasn't on the documents in front of him. It was on the community center event where Rachel had shared her story. Her words kept echoing in his mind. Second chances, empathy, hope. He had spent his entire career focusing on enforcing the law with precision, believing that justice could only be served through rigid adherence to the rules. But for the first time, he wondered if he had been wrong. He had dismissed Rachel's fine, but that was a rare exception in his courtroom. For years, he had prided himself on being tough but fair. Yet seeing how Rachel had turned her life around with just a little help had made him realize that sometimes compassion could be as powerful as punishment. Flashback. William thought back to his early days as a judge. He had been full of ambition, eager to prove himself as a man of principle. But over the years, the weight of the cases, the endless stream of defendants had hardened him. He stopped seeing the people in his courtroom as individuals with stories and struggles. They were simply numbers, case files to be resolved. But now, with Rachel's story fresh in his mind, William found himself at a crossroads. Could he continue judging people by the letter of the law, or was it time to adopt a more nuanced approach, one that allowed understanding and grace? Amanda stood in the kitchen washing dishes as the evening news played softly in the background. Her teenage son, Ethan, wandered in, grabbed a glass of water, and gave her a concerned look. "Mom, you look exhausted," he said, leaning against the counter. Amanda forced a smile. "I'm fine, sweetie. Just a long day at the center." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You've been saying that every day for the last 2 weeks. When was the last time you took a break?" Amanda sighed, her hands pausing in the soapy water. She had always prided herself on being able to balance her work and family life. But lately it felt like everything was spinning out of control. The resource center had seen a surge in requests for help, and she was constantly juggling new cases, working late into the night to make sure every family got the support they needed. But Ethan was right. She was tired, bone-deep tired, the kind of exhaustion that no amount of sleep could fix. And the truth was, Amanda was starting to feel like she was losing herself in the process. "Maybe you're right," she admitted, drying her hands. "It's just hard, you know. There are so many people who need help, and I feel like I can't let them down." Ethan gave her a sympathetic smile. "You can't help everyone, Mom. You've got to take care of yourself, too." Amanda knew he was right, but the thought of stepping back, even for a moment, filled her with guilt. Who would pick up the slack? Who would make sure that single parents like Rachel got the support they needed? But deep down, Amanda knew that if she didn't take care of herself, she wouldn't be able to take care of anyone else. William found himself more reflective in the weeks after the community event. He began to reconsider his approach in court, especially when it came to cases involving minor offenses and financial hardship. But his reputation as a strict judge was well known, and he struggled with the idea of showing more leniency. In his chambers, William sat alone, the heavy oak desk in front of him piled with case files. One caught his eye, a young man, Tyler, who had been caught shoplifting. It was a small crime, but Tyler's record showed repeated offenses, mostly petty thefts. William's instinct was to hand down a harsh sentence, a message that would deter Tyler from reoffending. But something stopped him. He flipped through the case file, his eyes narrowing at the details. Tyler came from a broken home, had dropped out of school, and had no stable job. His history was riddled with signs of neglect and poverty. William had seen cases like this before, young men with few options, stuck in cycles of desperation. Instead of handing down the usual sentence, William called for a meeting with Tyler's public defender. He wanted to understand more, why Tyler kept stealing, what his circumstances were. It was a small step, but it marked a shift in William's approach. For the first time, he was looking beyond crime to see the person behind it. Reflection. As William spoke with the public defender, he couldn't help but think of Rachel. What would have happened if he hadn't given her a second chance? What if he had dismissed her circumstances and punished her the way he had done with so many others? Maybe it was time for him to use his position to help, not just to judge. Amanda's workload continued to pile up, and the cracks in her resolve began to show. She found herself snapping at her coworkers, frustrated when things didn't go smoothly. The endless cases, the stories of hardship and loss, it was all starting to wear her down. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult meeting with a family on the verge of homelessness, Amanda closed the door to her office and collapsed into her chair, tears stinging her eyes. She hated feeling this way, overwhelmed and helpless. But no matter how hard she tried, there was always more work to be done, more people to help. She picked up her phone and stared at the contact list. Her therapist's number was there, but Amanda hadn't called her in months. She kept telling herself she didn't have time for therapy, that the families at the center needed her more than she needed to talk about her feelings. But the truth was, Amanda needed help. She had spent so much time helping others that she had forgotten to take care of herself. With a deep breath, she dialed the number. It was time to prioritize her own well-being, even if it meant stepping back from the center for a while. Weeks later, William found himself presiding over another case involving a single mother, Jessica, who had been charged with shoplifting. She had stolen diapers and baby formula from a local grocery store, and her public defender had painted a picture of a woman desperate to provide for her child. In the past, William would have handed down a sentence without hesitation, but today, he paused. He thought about Rachel, about Tyler, and about how easy it was for people in desperate situations to make mistakes. "Ms. Johnson," William said, his voice steady but softer than usual, "I understand that you were trying to provide for your child, but stealing is still a crime. However, I believe there are better ways to help you than simply punishing you." Jessica's eyes widened in surprise. William continued, "I'm going to refer you to the Single Parents Resource Center. They can help you with child care, employment assistance, and access to resources that will allow you to care for your child without breaking the law." As Jessica nodded tearfully, William felt a sense of satisfaction he hadn't felt in years. This was what justice should be, helping people find a way forward, not just punishing them for their mistakes. After several weeks of therapy, Amanda began to feel like herself again. She had stepped back from her responsibilities at the resource center, allowing her staff to take on more of the workload. It had been difficult at first, letting go of control and trusting others, but it had been necessary. One evening, as Amanda sat at home with her children, laughing over a board game, she realized how much she had missed moments like this. The constant grind of work had consumed her, but now she was finding balance again. When she returned to the center, Amanda was greeted with smiles and relief from her staff. They had managed while she was gone, but they were glad to have her back. As she settled into her office, Amanda felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew now that taking care of herself was just as important as taking care of the families she served. And with that realization, she was ready to continue her work, but this time with more balance. Word had spread about Judge Calhoun's change in approach, and Rachel couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She hadn't intended to change the judge's mind when she first stood in his courtroom, but seeing how her story had affected him made her realize the power of speaking up. One day, she received a call from Amanda. "Rachel, I have a favor to ask," Amanda began. "Judge Calhoun has been referring more families to the center, and I think it's because of you. I was wondering if you'd be willing to come in and talk to some of the new families. Share your story, help them see what's possible." Rachel hesitated. Public speaking still made her nervous, but she knew how important it was for people to hear stories of success, stories of second chances. "I'd love to," Rachel replied, her voice steady with confidence she hadn't felt in years. Months had passed since Judge William Calhoun started shifting his approach in the courtroom, and his changes had not gone unnoticed. His reputation as the by-the-book judge had been replaced by one that was more complex, someone who still upheld the law but had begun to see the people behind the cases. His courtroom had become a place of more thoughtful justice, and in some circles he was lauded for this. But not everyone was pleased. There were whispers among his colleagues, other judges who thought he was getting soft, defense attorneys who questioned whether this was a temporary change, and even prosecutors who had relied on his previous strictness. Internal conflict. William wrestled with this newfound attention. He had always believed that judges should not seek approval or popularity. Justice was about fairness, not about making people like you. But now he wondered if his new approach, while beneficial to those he was helping, might make him vulnerable to criticism. Late one evening, William sat in his chambers, staring at a letter from the Judicial Oversight Board. It was a routine review of his recent rulings. But William felt a creeping sense of doubt. Was he still the same judge who had once believed that the law must be enforced without bias? Or had his new compassion made him lose sight of that? New development. As William's inner turmoil grew, an opportunity arose. A former colleague, Judge Helen Marston, approached him with an idea: create a community court program aimed at rehabilitation and diversion rather than punishment for low-level offenders. It would be a pilot program in the city, one that would focus on addressing the root causes of crime, poverty, addiction, and lack of education, rather than simply handing out sentences. The idea intrigued William. It was a chance to take his new approach further, to institutionalize the compassion he had begun to practice. But it was also a risk. It would mean standing in the face of scrutiny from peers and committing to a path that could change the very nature of his career. As he considered the offer, William couldn't help but think of Rachel, Amanda, and all the others whose lives had been touched by a system that too often failed them. Was this his opportunity to leave a true legacy, one that went beyond simple rulings? Amanda stood outside the Single Parents Resource Center, taking a deep breath before walking inside. Her time away had given her the chance to recharge, but returning to work still felt daunting. She had spent the past few months reevaluating her life, understanding the toll her work had taken on her, and learning how to balance her own needs with her desire to help others. Inside the building, her staff greeted her warmly, and she could feel the weight of leadership settling back onto her shoulders. But this time, Amanda felt different. She was determined not to fall back into the same patterns that had led to her burnout. New focus. Amanda had made a decision during her time off. She would start mentorship programs at the center. She realized that while providing resources was essential, people like Rachel needed more than just financial support. They needed guidance, a sense of community, and someone to help them navigate their journey. Her first mentee was a young father, Michael, who had recently lost his job and was struggling to raise his 2 children. His wife had left shortly after the birth of their second child, and now he was trying to rebuild his life from scratch. As Amanda sat with him during their first meeting, she recognized the same look in his eyes that she had seen in Rachel's during those early days. Desperation mixed with determination. Internal reflection. As Amanda worked with Michael, she began to see her own story reflected in his struggles. The long hours, the endless worries, the fear of not being enough, it was all too familiar. But Amanda also saw the potential for growth. Just as Rachel had transformed her life, Amanda believed that Michael could do the same. Through their sessions, Amanda began to rediscover the passion she had for her work. It wasn't about fixing every problem or providing all the answers. It was about guiding people toward their own solutions, helping them see their strength, and being there when they needed someone to believe in them. As Amanda nurtured her mentees, she realized that this was where her true strength lay, not in being the one who had all the answers, but in being the one who could help others find their own. Rachel had come so far since that day in Judge Calhoun's courtroom. She had completed her degree, found a job she loved, and secured a stable home for her and Daniel. But as she looked ahead, Rachel realized that her journey wasn't over. There was still more she wanted to accomplish. One afternoon, as she sat at her desk at the nonprofit where she worked, an idea struck her. The organization had done amazing work in the community, but Rachel knew there was a gap that still needed to be filled: support for single parents looking to further their education. Rachel remembered the barriers she had faced when she first considered going back to school: the lack of childcare, the financial burden, the fear of failure. She knew that if it hadn't been for the support of Amanda and the resources Judge Calhoun had provided, she never would have made it. New vision. Inspired by her own experience, Rachel approached the nonprofit's board with a proposal: create a scholarship fund and mentorship program specifically for single parents pursuing higher education. The program would not only provide financial assistance but also pair participants with mentors, people like Rachel, who had been through the same struggles. The board was intrigued, and after months of planning, the program launched with Rachel as its director. It was a dream come true, a chance for her to give back and help others find the same opportunities that had changed her life. As Rachel settled into her new role, she couldn't help but feel proud of how far she had come, but there was also a part of her that wondered if this was just the beginning. She had always wanted to make a difference in the world, and now that she had the platform to do so, she was ready to take on even greater challenges. Judge Calhoun's decision to move forward with the community court program had not been easy, but once the wheels were in motion, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The program was designed to divert low-level offenders from jail and into rehabilitation and support services, everything from addiction counseling to job training and education. The first case he took on in the new program was Marcus, a young man who had been arrested for drug possession. Marcus had been in and out of the system for years, and most judges would have sentenced him to jail time without a second thought. But under the new program, Marcus was given the opportunity to enter a rehabilitation program with the promise that if he completed it successfully, his charges would be dropped. Judge Calhoun watched Marcus closely throughout the process, attending his court-mandated check-ins and speaking with his counselors. He saw the struggles Marcus faced, the temptation to fall back into old habits, the fear of failure, but he also saw something else: the potential for change. Climax. Months later, Marcus stood before Judge Calhoun, having successfully completed his program. His charges were dismissed, and as he left the courtroom, William felt a sense of pride he hadn't experienced in years. This was what justice should be, not just punishment but rehabilitation, growth, and second chances. But William knew that the program's success would be measured by more than just one case. There were others like Marcus, people who needed the system to give them a chance to rebuild their lives, and William was determined to make sure they got that chance. Amanda's mentorship program had become a cornerstone of the Single Parents Resource Center. Parents like Michael were thriving under her guidance, and the relationships she built with her mentees reminded her why she had started this work in the first place. One afternoon, Amanda received an unexpected visitor. Samantha, a former mentee who had recently completed her degree and found a job as a social worker. Samantha had come to thank Amanda for her support and to offer her help in expanding the mentorship program. Amanda felt a surge of pride as she listened to Samantha's story. This was what it was all about, helping people not only survive but thrive, and then watching them pay it forward. With Samantha's help, Amanda began to expand the program, offering workshops on financial literacy, parenting, and career development. New challenge. But as the program grew, so did the demand for resources. Amanda found herself facing the same challenges she had dealt with before. Too many families in need, not enough funding or staff to meet the demand. But this time, Amanda was determined not to burn out. She had learned the importance of delegating, of trusting others to carry some of the load. With the help of her staff, Amanda applied for new grants and built partnerships with local businesses to secure more funding for the center. She was no longer trying to do it all on her own. She had a team, a community, and a renewed sense of balance. As Rachel's scholarship and mentorship program took off, she found herself working closely with Judge Calhoun's Community Court initiative. Many of the parents who came through the program were eligible for scholarships, and Rachel became a key figure in helping them transition from court-ordered programs to educational opportunities. One day, as she sat in the courtroom observing a case, Rachel felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She had been in the same position as these parents, scared, unsure, desperate for a way out. But now, she was the one offering a lifeline, helping others find the path that had been offered to her. As the judge dismissed the charges for another participant in the pilot program, Rachel felt a deep sense of purpose. This was where she belonged, at the intersection of justice and opportunity, helping people rebuild their lives. By the end of this journey, Judge William Calhoun, Amanda Collins, and Rachel Parker had all found new paths, each of them shaped by their pasts, but driven by a shared desire to make the world a better place. Judge Calhoun's community court program had become a model for others, proving that rehabilitation could work where punishment had failed. Amanda's mentorship program had expanded beyond the resource center, offering single parents across the city a chance to rebuild their lives with support and guidance. Rachel's scholarship fund had opened doors for countless parents to pursue higher education, changing not only their lives but the lives of their children. Each had faced their own struggles and doubts, but they had emerged stronger. Now they stood together, ready to continue their work, building a world where second chances were not only possible but embraced. If you enjoyed following the journeys of Judge Calhoun, Amanda, and Rachel, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Stay updated on more inspiring stories of resilience, redemption, and hope. Hit the subscribe button now and be part of a community that believes in the power of second chances.